So for that reason, the video stream of the audience will be kept off. In case you have questions, please feel free to type it in the comment box, in the question and answer box, or the chat box at the center bottom of your screen. Also, please add to the text of your question or comment who you're addressing it to. And could you also please specify if you're willing to speak? In that case, I will unmute you, or we're more than happy to read out the question as well. So intellectual history and political thought in recent times have taken a global turn in an attempt to move beyond nation and modern in historical analysis. The most significant intellectual contribution of these works have been to question the globality of intellectual history and their traditions. In turn, they have urged scholars to introduce spaces beyond the Anglophone world within the realm of intellectual history. This panel seeks to ask, in what ways can we think of the archive beyond the textual and the recorded? What alternative registers can be redefined as archives for writing histories of ideas? The papers in this panel look towards drama, visual arts, and literature as possible sources for rethinking the archival basis of intellectual history writing and in turn decolonizing the discipline. To chair this panel, we have with us today Professor Vincent Lloyd joining us from Villanova. Professor Lloyd is Associate Professor of Theology and Religious Studies at Villanova University, where he also directs the Africana Studies program. His research focuses on the intersection of religion, race, and politics using the tools of critical theory. His books include Black Natural Law, the co-authored Break Every Yoke, Religion, Justice, and the Abolition of Prisons, and the co-edited Race and Secularism in America. He also co-edits the wonderful journal Political Theology. Our discussant for today is Dr. Hussein Omar, who's joining us from Dublin. He's a lecturer in modern global history. He's a cultural and intellectual historian of the modern Middle East and comes to UCD from Oxford University, where he was a part of an AHRC postdoctoral fellow as a part of the First World War and Global Religions Project. His current research examines the anti-colonial insurrectionary movement in Egypt and Iraq between 1919 to 1920. It builds on his forthcoming monograph titled The Rule of Strangers, Empire, Islam, and the Invention of Politics in Egypt between 1867 to 1922, which examined political ideas as well as the very emergence of politics as an autonomous category in Egypt between 1867 and 1922. With that, I will let Professor Lloyd take over from here, and yeah, all yours.
Thank you so much, Shuvatri, for convening us. And I have the pleasure to introduce our three panelists who will each speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have our response and then time for discussion. Our first panelist, I'll introduce all three and then they can begin speaking. First, we have Senayon Olaoluwa, who obtained his PhD in African literature from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. He's the acting director at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria. His publications have appeared in English Studies in Africa, European Journal of English Studies, Critique Studies in Contemporary Fiction, Journal of African Cultural Studies, Research in African Literatures, and the Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and the Environment, among others. Then we'll have Heidi Andrea Restrepo Rhodes, who's a poet, scholar, educator, and cultural worker. She's a PhD candidate in political theory at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York in New York City, and works at the intersection of feminist and decolonial thought. Her dissertation is titled Afterlives of Discovery, Speculative Geographies in the Colombian Political Landscape. Her poetry book, The Inheritance of Haunting, published by the University of Notre Dame Press in 2019, explores histories of violence, collective memory, and intergenerational trauma. She is a spring 2021 Mellon Arts and Practitioners Fellow at the Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, and currently teaches writing in the Liberal Studies Department at NYU. Olga Byrska is a second-year PhD researcher in history at the European University Institute in Florence, currently working on the intellectual history of the immediate post-World War II era. Earlier, she worked as a researcher at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. She graduated with a degree in theater at the National Academy of Dramatic Arts in Warsaw and studied cultural studies in Paris and Warsaw. She has translated essays by Simone de Beauvoir, Axiom Dembe, and Paul Preciado, among others. She's a contributor to the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw and to numerous publishing houses. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Senayon.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor. I'll quickly share. Is my screen up for everyone? All right. So I would like to thank the organizers of this program for considering my paper worth selecting for this presentation. My paper is entitled Disconnected Evolution Toward a History of the Longer African Novel Tradition. What I do basically in this work is to consider the evolution of modern African literature that is fashioned after the European tradition. And to that extent, we'll begin to talk about issues around the various phases of the invention of Africa. I mean, which resonates with Mudimbe's notion of the invention of Africa. And so I am looking at that notion of the invention of Africa and how it is implicated in the broad-based history of the encounter of Africa with the rest of the world, beginning with from Asia to Europe and to the New World. While each phase of encounter produced new realities of reconfiguration in and about the continent, this paper is concerned about the larger history of the most recent encounter, especially in the past 500 years with Europe and its consequences for literary expression on the continent. And so the most recent attempt at inventing Africa produced the twin legacies of slavery and colonialism on the continent. Now, the latter, I mean colonialism, evolved a simultaneous tradition of literacy that was superimposed on the previous literacy patrimonies on the continent, meaning even when beginning with the invention of writing in ancient Egypt to all the other forms of writing that Africa had experienced, colonialism, Western colonialism brought a new form of writing and together with it, a new literary tradition. And so I am interested in that legacy, in that literary legacy that was bequeathed to Africa via Western colonialism. So I argue that colonialism operated through various tools in Africa, and the most prominent of these was literacy, through which the ideal of formal schooling that began with European missionaries, eventually became part of the civilizing mission. And of the schooling legacies, certainly the most prominent strand of bequeathing Africa with a new legacy of artistic expression was through the agency of literature. European, especially the British literary tradition, became a model for learning by African learners within the colonial milieu and beyond. Again, I argue that of all the genres of literature to which African learners were introduced via schooling, the novel subgenre of fiction was the most preeminent and most popular, becoming, as it were, a byword for default literature. Now, to that extent, I read African literature, recent African literature, as something, as a tradition modeled after the European tradition. And that already speaks to the question of entanglement, the entanglement of the modern African literature, with the British, especially for countries that were colonized by Britain, and of course, generally Europe, would discover that entanglement of African literature and European literature. And so it is possible, therefore, to begin to talk about the British literary masterpieces since the decisive emergence of the novel in the West in the 18th century. The British tradition has produced many greats. A number of these canonical and classical texts expectedly made it to the learning curriculum at various levels of colonial education in Africa and led to the ultimate invention of the modern African literary tradition after the fashion of Europe. Some examples of the British greats will be Robinson Crusoe, Moll Flanders, Great Expectations, Hard Times, Tom Jones, Ulysses, and we can go on and on. I am interested particularly in these exemplars and how their greatness was reinforced by the combination of profundity and creative insights in such a way that all these were for granted in the sheer volume of these literary pieces, so that you begin to talk about Moll Flanders not only from the perspective of what it stands for in the British literary history, but also in terms of its projection as a voluminous text. Great Expectations, 544 pages. Tom Jones, one of the earliest, 848 pages. Ulysses, 730 pages. And then we can then begin to talk about the invention of the African novel tradition beyond mimicry. And so colonialism facilitated the invention of a certain strain of the African novel after the tradition of Europe. And it was in restful consciousness, beginning mostly from the late 19th century in the Southern African region. Various forms of literary writing after the fashion of European literary tradition had begun to emerge. The writings exuded the sophistication
I think we may be having some
and depth of European greats. Now, I am saying something about the peculiarity of the slimness of the African classics, especially within the first 100 years, the first century, when we take it that the African novel began to evolve in the late 19th century. And so what we will find, whether from Umudi or to other ones, to Achebe's classical Things Fall Apart, is that they are peculiarly slim. Things Fall Apart is 150 pages. Ayikweyi Ama's the beautiful ones, Not Yet Born, is only 182 pages. Whip Not Child, 153 pages. In fact, Alex Laguma's classic is only 90 pages. And then you begin to talk about Emechetan's The Bread Price, 168 pages. And then to that extent, I argue that there is a connect and disconnect between the African novel tradition that is fashioned after the great tradition of Europe, and from that perspective of how it is profound and slim at the same time, instead of combining slimness and voluminous specimens. But, you know, as from the 1990s, meaning from the turn of the 21st century, what we find dramatically radical is the emergence of what I then call the invention of the longer African novel tradition, whereby Ben Okri's The Famished Road, came to the fore with 574 pages, and to Brings an Act of Terror, 834 pages. And then in the 20th century, Unkuki Wise Younger would join that by producing Wizard of the Crow, 768 pages, Mandela, we cannot forget Mandela's A Long Walk to Freedom, which is 751 pages. Achebe came up with his autobiography, a set of memoirs. You Must Set Forth at Dawn at 577 pages, and Chimamanda's, Americana will participate in that, and showing us most recent work, 2021, Chronicles of the Land of the Happiest People on Earth, is 512 pages. Now, this, I argue, raises certain questions that are addressed in this paper. For instance, what factors accounted for the initial and exclusive slimness of the African novel tradition? This question, challenges us to look at the circumstances around which the African novel evolved. It was a desperate time. It was a time of great sense of urgency. There was that urgent need to respond, and it didn't create enough time. It didn't allow for enough time for the novel to be profound and voluminous at the same time, because African writers were very, very anxious to quickly make their point. And how did the exclusive slimness illustrate a disconnect from the norm in the European tradition? And to that extent, you discover that while it exhibits a certain pattern of semblance to the European tradition, it also departs from it. So it is about entanglement and disentanglement. And then at the same time, we begin to see that even before the 90s, a few novels like Ngugi's Petals of Blood can be regarded like Ama's 2000 Seasons. I argue that occupy a certain kind of intermediate position, serving as precursors to the full evolution of the longer African novel tradition. And then I argue, I am also interested in why the 1990s? Why were the 1990s particularly decisive in the emergence? There is a sense in which that also reflects the general socio-political imaginary of Africa at the time. Most of the African nations were beginning to experience the peak of dictatorship and were also gradually stepping towards the reinstitution of democratic rules, which created a kind of relaxed, a kind of tension, a kind of climatic tension at the same time, and relaxation because of the gradual transition to democracy, which created a greater sense of relaxation for the writers to develop, longer novels. I would like to illustrate that with Ngugi's conscious theorizing of that in Wizard of the Crow, where AG, the storyteller, tells everybody who cares to listen to his story that he will not be browbeaten or literally intimidated into rushing his stories. And so, for instance, Ngugi spent over 10 years writing that, a sense of relaxation to eventually produce that, incredible, voluminous work. Now, how does the turn, I'm also interested in how the turn of the longer African novel tradition dramatized a reconnection with the European, tradition of longer novels. So to that extent, I argue that the turn of the 21st century has created and facilitated this full circle, in which case the African novel tradition can perfectly compare with the tradition of Europe, where you can talk of slim and voluminous, novels at the same time. Then, so this is, some of the things I am looking at, and then the autobiographies or the biographical writings generally have also participated in that. From Achebe's, There Was a Country, to Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom, to Soyinka's You Must Set Forth at Dawn, we'll begin to see how all this, considering the fictional dimension to biographical writing, have participated, and it is for me, important that we register this in the history of the African novel, and to look at how generally this resonates with the larger question of the invention of Africa. I would like to thank you all. I'm done.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. I know I have many questions, as others have questions as well. Please put them in the Q&A or the chat while we're moving on to the next presentation, which will be by Heidi. I'll turn it over to you, Heidi.
Thank you. Let me just pull up the screen. Can everybody see the screen share okay?
Yes.
Okay.
You're good.
So thank you everybody in the Cambridge University History Department for making this event happen. And thank you to my fellow panelists, as well as Dr. Lloyd and Dr. Omar for being our chair and discussant for today. My paper is titled Feelings, Futures, Frontiers, Settler Colonial Affect in the Visual Archive. And I'm looking at a 1913 painting titled Horizontes, or Horizons, by Colombian artist Francisco Antonio Cano. A canonical visual text of national pride, the painting's primary role in Colombian history, as perhaps the country's most famous work of art, has been to solidify an idealization of settler colonization, as well as the founding myths and national sense of self predicated on the substance of European political and intellectual colonial histories. My aim in this paper is to contribute to decolonizing the visual archive by reading this canonical work as an invocation of settler colonial affect in the afterlife of discovery, a psychosocial cartography epistemically orienting the Colombian public, both of its time and in the present, toward a geographic, ontological, and temporal horizon of settler futurity. The painting, I suggest, entangles Colombian 20th century modernity with earlier European modernities, acting as an apparatus of affective production in the service of settler formation and its constitutive projects of New World genocide and land dispossession. By eliding both the class-based struggles of Colombia's poor peasantry and the complicity of its subjects in the racialized violence of settler colonialism and its property regimes, it performs a kind of optic propaganda, inciting an affective and political consonance with the project of internal settler colonization. Considered by critics to mark the beginning of modern art in Colombia, Francisco Antonio Cano's Horizontes depicts the quintessential settler family of Colombia's Antioquia region. A light-skinned mestizo family, they're seated on a rock at the edge of a plateau of earth, appearing as if they're resting amidst a journey through the Eje Cafetero, Colombia's coffee triangle, a rural region in the northwest. The man wears a straw hat typical to Antioqueño farmers and carries a hatchet, a tool crucial to working the land and a symbol of generational memory and tradition. Rope secures a pack to his back with what appears to be a blanket, a symbol of the marriage bed and hence the domestic sphere, the home that will be built, and perhaps underneath some food and other basic goods. The woman, presumed to be his wife, holds an infant in her arms, the axis of composition placing the infant as an extension of his father's arm holding the hatchet, the future settler farmer in the making. A review of the artwork in a 1913 issue of El Gráfico, written by Fidel Cano, cousin to the artist and founder of Colombia's oldest newspaper, El Espectador, suggests that the artist's superb talent lies in infusing in each element of the image a deep truth and universality of the Colombian spirit, such that its Colombian viewers are compelled to disabuse themselves of regionalist affections and memories toward embracing the greater social and moral order of national endeavor. In the years following its completion, Horizontes was marketed as a national treasure, vigorously replicated and disseminated with a concerted effort to place the painting in every Colombian home, rich or poor. Fidel Cano declares, "That picture is going to be for every child of the land, the living representation of the home itself, the faithful emblem of their beloved homeland, and in some, our sacred human family. The popularity of the painting spread widely and quickly, leading the artist to consider it a representation of the soul of the people of Colombia. In its success, Francisco Cano had elevated to epic proportions the sense of possibility for the displaced human in search of new lands, new horizons, though the image of the displaced human was of the white or mestizo settler migrant, never of the indigenous or Black life displaced by the era's frontierism. Indeed, the engineer and writer Alejandro Lopez considered the painting to be the inventor of the whole colonial adventure, a contentious process of territorial expansion. The painting draws on global affective intimacies that tied Colombia's early 20th century public to two major threads of Western mythology that were appropriated for the settler colonial project. First, in a gesture compared by several scholars to Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam, the man his left hand to the horizon, far off the view of the canvas, and the gazes of all three subjects of the painting follow. He reflects the Renaissance era European image of man as made in the Christian Catholic God's image. This motif bears implications for settler colonial processes of land expropriation as a God-given right bestowed on the country's whitened population through the values and logics of the discovery doctrine. The white, heteropatriarchal Colombian settler setting out to recreate God's heaven on earth, the earthly paradise, which Colombia has often been called across the centuries by explorers, scientists, and entrepreneurs. But what is more, I see in the male figure of Cano's work a bodily comportment mirroring images depicting the age of discovery, glorifying European exploration, appropriation of land, and settlement. The two examples I give here are from 19th century paintings. If the religious affiliation of Cano's painting invokes man in the image of God, the affiliation of discovery invokes man in the image of Columbus, where Columbus is a stand-in for the figure of the explorer-discoverer. In Emmanuel Gottlieb Lutz's 1855 painting, Departure of Columbus from Palos in 1492, Columbus stands atop the ship, ready to sail off into the great unknown of unmapped territory, his arm extended to our right, his finger pointing to the horizon that stretches beyond the canvas frame. Similarly, in the painting Discovery of Brazil, I don't know how much people can see it because in my screen our faces are covering half of it, but Francisco Aurelio de Figueiredo e Melo's 1900 depiction of the Portuguese explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral and his fleet. Cabral's arm, in the painting, Cabral's arm extends finger pointed to our right, often to the horizon, as other members of his fleet point with him, confirming the moment of discovery, the land of the new world ahead. The implications here are that Cano's painting doesn't merely represent the idealized Colombian national subject, but instantiates an affective milieu through which settler colonial futurity is cultivated. The affective arrangements incited by the painting exist in the afterlife of discovery, are nurtured by a centuries-long elaboration of discovery's applications. They inherit from the ongoing past and bequeath to the future. Mark Rifkin writes, understanding settlement as a structure of feeling entails asking how emotions, sensations, and psychic life take part in the ongoing process of exerting non-native authority over indigenous peoples, governance, and territoriality. Cano's painting in the afterlife of discovery invokes settlement as a structure and mode of feeling for the frontier. This feeling for the frontier, the desire to embody this quintessential spirit, then also shapes individual and national anticipation and memory, what the self of man as citizen and the self of the nation as a space and expression of power will become, and what history they will draw on in seeing to that becoming. This iteration of settler colonial affect permeates and conjures somatic states, wiring the nervous system and bodily physiology toward neuroelectrical and chemical resonances with settler expansionism. To view Horizontes in a decolonial light is to witness the production and dissemination of settler colonial futures as desirable to the Colombian settler who is beckoned into existence as an everyman. In the afterlife of discovery, the painting's affective intensities summon in its viewing what Kathleen Stewart has called a gathering place of accumulative dispositions. It enacts a kind of mimetic communication in Anna Gibbs' terms, as it entreats from the Colombian public corporeally based forms of imitation, both voluntary and involuntary. These forms of imitation unfold through a kind of affective contagion, synchronies, the pervasive sharing of form, of facial expressions, bodily gestures, postures, movements, behaviors, and emotional convergences. The non-Indigenous Colombian masses, in buying into the romanticism of the image, synchronize with the affective landscape of settler futurity. In doing so, they're not only conscripted into harmony with its ethos, this synchronization also conscripts the public into both unconscious liberal antagonisms toward Indigenous people, whose presence may prove an obstacle to settling land understood in Lockean terms as wasteland, unoccupied, belonging to no one, as well as more conservative enmity toward Indigenous organizers who come to be seen as a subversive threat to national order. Today, Cano's painting is reproduced en masse in large and small scales across the country. In Medellin, the capital of Antioquia, the regional home of the settler figure in Horizontes, the image, I'm told, is enlarged and replicated as a mural in one of the city's largest banks, inside a major train station, and with a street view above the Guayaquil market in Plaza de Luz. The painting permeates the city more than 100 years after its completion, infusing the everyday comings and goings of civilians with the ongoing affective transmission of national pride in the image of settler colonial desire. It remains a familiar installment in family homes as well. The image migrates, repeats through time, even as it changes, is appropriated by advertising firms, or revised through pop culture or art for a new generation. And here are just a few examples. This is Madonna on a 2012 tour visit to Medellin, participating in a recreation of the work. I'm not totally clear on the context. I couldn't find that information. This is a recreation with an Apple computer in place of the infant, sort of, which I read as a suggestion of technology being sort of elemental to the birth of settler futures or technological futures. This is a recreation by the mayoral office of Medellin in 2020 to encourage people to wear masks in the pandemic. So just to show its proliferation and revision across time. In 2020 alone, over 330 human rights workers were killed, 2/3 of which were working to defend environmental land and Indigenous people's rights. Indigenous communities continue to face killings, torture, and forced displacement from ancestral lands as multinational corporations collude with the state and parastate forces to conquest those lands for extractive industries, with minimal public outcry from the masses. Indigenous and Black land is still viewed with a settler colonial gaze as an empty and conquerable frontier. Internal settler colonization takes new shape as the drive to accumulation, its justifications of violence are emboldened by silence and complacency of those who see themselves as true Colombians. So also migrates across space and time, the settler colonial affective landscape in the afterlife of discovery. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, doing exactly what the panel is charging us with and unearthing new archives and thinking in new ways about historical material. Again, if you have questions or thoughts or reflections that you'd like to share ahead of the formal question and answer period, please feel free to add them to the Q&A or to the chat. And now we'll turn to our third presentation by Olga.
Thank you very much. it's a completely different subject from especially the ending of Heidi's presentation. So it's a completely different mood. Thank you so much for staying with us or joining us this lovely Saturday pandemic afternoon or morning. And this won't be a classic presentation, but rather an invitation to think together through certain issues that I pointed out in my paper that I will briefly summarize shortly, because I don't think that this is an area of studies, this convergence of theater and performance studies and historical research that is being very well thought of from the point of view of history. Much more presence is seen in theater and performance studies when it comes to history and the questions of reenactment, archive, documentation of performances. So I would like to just give you some more context or some complementary remarks to what I wrote. So in my paper, I focused on showing that theater and performance studies actually have a lot in common with the discipline of history. And I briefly depicted the ways in which these two areas can and indeed do intersect, as both of them deal with temporalities of an event and with the notion of the archive. So I refer to Diana Taylor's distinction of archive and repertoire in order to show how historians can expand their understanding of sources, including also the types of knowledge that aren't easily transmittable through embodied practices. I also proposed borrowing a notion of scenario as a prism to look at archival clusters, since it might propel us to ask different questions, the ones that are related to the construction of the archiving itself. Then, through the example of Sabrina Mahfouz's play, A Brief History of Water in the Middle East, I showed how a conscious narrative practice of zooming in and out, which is very well known for us historians, can be applied in reflection about temporalities, how it holds a potential to destabilize already existing narratives, either on macro or micro level. And finally, I touched a little bit on Rebecca Schneider's account on war reenactments and her argument on the possibly unnecessary division of history and memory. And it should be noted here that both Diana Taylor and Rebecca Schneider used their theoretical approach to complicate and undermine the Western canons of knowledge, and canons of knowledge about knowledge, the ways in which ideas and practices are being transmitted, how they circulate, and how they interact. Anyway, Diana Taylor, in her introduction to the archive and the repertoire, recalls her personal non-belonging as a Mexican American to neither of the cultures, while at the same time belonging to the both of them. But then, of course, that merits also mentioning the broader context of the theater and performance art studies as an area of studies that was very much influenced by the 1960s counterculture, anthropology, and it's strongly related to post-structuralist thought, because this discipline has been breaking with the Durkheimian vision of normative behaviors and has been trying actively to renounce the colonial gaze in anthropology, because it basically asks the question, okay, we are watching certain cultures or certain events or certain performances, but who am I, who am I watching? Like what type of axioms, what type of setup and pre-existing notions I bear in my mind, so I can see these performing people either on stage or just in normal life as performance studies use much of a vocabulary of Michel de Certeau, for instance. So this is one point, and the second point that also brings more of a context to that is that this reflection on the archive and repertoire derives very much from the postmodernist thought, because the main text of reference of it for it is Jacques Derrida's essay "The Archive Fever" from 1995. So he shows there how archive creates memory and how memory creates archive, how archive also assigns what is lawful and what is unlawful, and what ultimately gains the power over the setup of the archive in itself. And then, of course, it would be good to renounce also the axiom of the intellectual history when we talk about this kind of intersection, because it kind of take us for granted that that type of intellectual history is, or supposed to be, a field of study that is unashamedly transdisciplinary, and that doesn't shy away from borrowing methodologies from other areas of studies. So also, I think that this kind of meta reflection on which tools we can use, to what extent, how the tools that we're using are being shaped by the object of our studies, and how we shape our reflection through our tools, also can bring us to discover probably some new tools in itself, and to have a very interesting discussion about our intellectual honesty as intellectual historians when dealing with our objects of study, and on how we interact also with other types of studies and other perspectives. So I'm looking forward to discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for that presentation, Olga, taking the Diana Taylor's crucially important work and turning it inside out, complicating the concept of the archive rather than moving away from it. We now have time for Hussein to offer a response.
Thank you all so much for 3 very stimulating papers, and thank you, Professor Lloyd, for sharing. Thank you, Shivatri, for the invitation. I learned quite a lot from all of the papers and from hearing you speak to and from them. I want to begin by 3 general question comments to all of you, and which I will then follow by 3 individual kind of small points to each one of you. So the first question I have is one of categorization. The papers you've presented, and I don't mean this at all in a disparaging way, could have equally been presented under the labels of theater studies, literature, or art history. So what happens when we move them out from under these categories or disciplines and describe the works you are examining as intellectual history? What changes if we think of these papers as falling under the purview of intellectual history rather than under literary or theater studies, or indeed art history? I suppose I'm less concerned with the history part, although feel free to reflect on the historicity of your objects of study, and more concerned with what it is that makes them intellectual particularly. And further, can we consider them to be sites of particularly political rather than aesthetic, affective, or cultural ideas alone? In some ways, this leads me to the second question, which is about genre. To what extent is genre important to the stories you're telling? The focus on the novel, on plays, and on painting make different arguments, all in their own ways compelling, about them as loci of intellectual history. So I suppose the question is, why these genres? I'm asking you to zoom out a little bit and reflect on where else in the various moments that you are describing might we find the material with which to write the history of ideas in these respective periods. In other words, is the argument that the more quote unquote usual archive is silent on the questions you are asking and interested in answering? Or is the argument that this is the only location for whatever reason, due to accessibility, loss, damage, or whatever, from which to write the history of ideas? Or is this enriching a pre-existing narrative? And finally, if it's allowing us to completely rethink the narratives that we have received, what does considering the various genres that you consider do to undo the assumptions that we have about what constitutes the location of the properly political in thought and where it is thought to reside? Now, onto the three specific questions. For Senayon, you talk about the slimness of the early African novel and compare it with more lengthy tomes such as Ulysses, Maud Flanders, etc. But I was wondering whether instead of comparing quote unquote African novels with quote unquote European novels, whether we might engage in more kind of South-South comparisons. And of course, sitting here in Dublin, I'm thinking that Ulysses is, of course, itself the product of the colonization of Ireland and the attempt to decolonize it. Indeed, it can be and has been read as a post-colonial novel published in the years of Ireland's nominal independence, in the year of Ireland's nominal independence. If we think of Ulysses as a product of the colonized rather than produced by the colonizer, what happens to the term of your comparison? What happens to the comparative aspects of your paper if the contrast that is being drawn isn't between Europe and Africa as such, but between novels produced in two different types of colonial spaces, West Africa and Ireland or South Africa and Ireland? For Olga, sorry, I've got these in the order in which they appeared in my email, so I'll go Olga. For Olga, I was intrigued by your exploration of Kierkegaard's repetition in the paper itself, and I wondered if we might take the metaphor of repetition to think one of the great problematics of intellectual history, which is that of how ideas travel, and particularly in the context of travel from the metropole to the colony. For the longest time, one of the biggest obstacles of doing intellectual history in the post-colonial world was the assumption that it was a place devoid of original ideas, and a place that, or a set of places that could at very best mimic metropolitan ones. It too was seen as a place of repetition, but where the repeated performance, if you like, in the colony itself was just a defective version, both tragic and farcical, of an impeccable original, metropolitan original. So is there something there in thinking for you about repetition, not just in the context of repetition of repeated performances, a recreation of performances, but in relation to the diffusion of ideas, and might that be valuable for thinking through the problems that you are thinking through? And finally, for Heidi, by reading Cano's painting as a site of the production of settler colonial feeling, which I really like, and I think you've sort of convinced us all that that's clearly what it's about. You say you were aiming to decolonize readings of the painting, but you tell us less about how the painting is and has been more commonly understood before your decolonial reading, as it were. What is the orthodox interpretation of this work against which you are fielding your own? Thanks so much.
Great. We have plenty of time for first responses from the three presenters, and then for discussion with the audience.
All right. Can I take?
It looks like we
to be an internet.
Delete. All right. Thank you very much.
Sorry, we couldn't
from another
hear
perspective. Oh, so
could
sorry.
you
But...
start? No, it's okay.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right. I was going to say that the question regarding how our papers could have been presented on another panel. Well, the point about that for me is that we are dealing with the entanglement of several things here. So whether we say the presentations are better suited for a literary engagement or for an exploration in intellectual history, what connects both for me is the fact that we cannot engage in such forms of exploration without considering the landscape of power and how that in itself has always framed the various ways in which we account for history of whatever kind, whether literary history, intellectual history, or any form of history. And so to that extent, you discover that the engagement with the question of colonialism will have something to do with this. And more specifically to the question about the possibility of a South-South comparison, of course, in that arbitrary sense, in which case we begin to look at the history of the Irish colonialism as still being part of the history of the global South, even when geographically you want to locate it in Western Europe. Very well, I must say that for me further challenges me to reflect further on how I go about this exploration in the entanglement and disentanglement that occurs when we begin to consider the understanding of modern African literature as something that evolved out of the history of Western colonialism in Africa. And as I do that, I'll begin to read Ulysses, by James Joyce from another perspective, which for me has the potential of investing the paper with a greater level of sophistication. I would like to thank you. I'm done.
Should I go next?
Yeah, please.
So I'll start with the individual question. Thank you, Hussein. So my understanding of the typical reception of this painting across the last century plus has been that there's a lot of romanticism toward it, particularly because the history of internal settlement patterns and the history of the sort of subjectivation of the ideal Colombian national subject has been very focused on the image of the Antioqueño, which has this typically white mestizo racial history, but also there's a lot of romanticism, particularly in Antioquia, of the self as industrious and hardworking. So there's the romanticization of labor, but of a particular kind of labor that I think was conducive towards settlements. And then that image of the Antioqueño was really dispersed across the country and pressed into the collective imagination as the ideal way to be a true Colombian. So that's my understanding of the more dominant experience of this painting and the way that it's been treated. I think in more recent years, there have been more critical reads of it and understanding it as reproducing a lot of these kinds of romanticism towards settlement. And part of my paper also talks about what's outside the frame that we don't see in this image that is both kind of realist, but also has this romanticism and bucolic, it's just the land and these people and bright weather, good climate. But outside of that frame, there's all this political contention happening, conflict over land, indigenous uprisings. It comes in the wake of the 1,000 Days War at the turn of the century, where there was just bloody violence between liberal and conservative parties. So I also talk about that, how this painting sort of erases all the political context in which the image itself is living. As far as your questions on genre, I'm just a very interdisciplinary thinker on one hand, but also I'm interested in this idealization of this image of this white settler figure as an ideal of the true Colombian, and thinking about how that erases the vast diversity of who Colombians are, even though the country has a very multicultural legal structure, juridical structure. I think also in terms of this repetition of discovery and the theme of discovery showing up again and again, I'm interested in looking at other kinds of cultural production happening around the same time as this image, to think about just the larger sphere of what was being legitimated as the way for the nation to become itself. And I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I do see it as very political, as well as part of a history of ideas being disseminated across time and space. So disciplinarily, it's blurry for me, and I think I don't tend to make hardline distinctions between genre or discipline, but just see a lot of fruitful possibility in where they entangle and intersect.
Thank you for your questions. Yes, to start with the more general question on why intellectual history, not theater studies, or how is it political, not aesthetic. I think my answer will be very much similar to Heidi's answer. I think that what interests me both in intellectual history and in theater and in general in intellectual life is how ideas function in a certain context, but also how ideas are being produced via categories that then kind of narrow down the significance of the very meaning that we assign to these ideas and categories. And I think that theater, because it is so concerned with something that is very unstable, like this theatrical or performative temporality, is something that is just there, and then it's just not there anymore, right? And it's just its ontological status is just so unstable that it disrupts those categories, and it implodes these categories in a way that I think intellectual historians, when thinking about ideas and about their circulation and about their contextualization, that they really need that, because we tend to take so many things for granted, and we of course use those notions of the context, of differences in time, and we try to define certain notions and certain categories according to the times that we or the periods that we work on. But I think that that even then we sometimes lack the tools, or when looking at certain sources that we use, we sometimes feel like maybe there's more to that that we just cannot see or cannot really grasp, or we don't have the vocabulary, or we don't have the idea how to do this. And I think that performance art that from the 60s, it's been probably the most political and one of the most progressive tools when fighting for decolonizing not only academia, but also societies and queering societies, and giving much more just span of and spine of human differences. I think that this is a beautiful tool. And when it comes to Kierkegaard's repetition, yes, I completely agree, because this repetition, actually there's this to simplify this Kierkegaard's reflection, actually, he said also that not only we cannot repeat a performance twice in, but we cannot fall in love for the second time as we fallen in love for the first time in the same person, which is I think beautifully depicted. And I think that absolutely, because the same ideas in metropole and in colony, when they travel, they are not the same anymore, right? This travel, this journey itself makes it completely different. And then still borrowing the terms from the performance studies, the audience of those ideas, or actors that perform those ideas, it just changes those ideas completely. So for me, this is the ultimate proof how intellectual history and theater, how close they are to each other, because every single factor works towards differentiation of those ideas. And I guess this is something really that maybe this conversation that we've been having is just the beginning of something. But just after writing this paper, I for instance, I stumbled upon an amazing article called "Blackface Behind Barbed Wire: Gender and Racial Triangulation in the Japanese American Intermittent Camps," where Japanese American, second generation of the Japanese American very young women who were held by the US Army in intermittent camps after Pearl Harbor attack. They performed blackface minstrels, and it's easy just to take it as a, just like an performance, like racist performance. But actually, the author, Emily Roxworthy, she actually proves that that was some sort of a resistance, of a gesture of resistance against both the Japanese, against the American army, and also against the patriarchy that kind of took out of them the agenda. And actually, this strange camp and this place of this prison, in fact, that was one of the very few places where they could shy away from the borders and from the patriarchy that was kind of assigned upon them by the Japanese society. So those liminal places actually can just show us so many things, and I think that theater is an amazing tool to do this. Sorry.
Wonderful, thanks. We have so much more to talk about as these responses begin to open up. We have about half an hour, maybe 25 minutes left for discussion with the audience. And I see we already have a question come in. If you have more questions, please use the Q&A or the chat, and we'll be happy to include them. And if you want to ask them yourselves, I think you can indicate that as well. And there's some technological way that we can do that. I see we have a question from Julia Prof. Oriani, who asks to Heidi, thanks for your great reading of Kano's painting. Could you say something about his training and how that training shaped his modern style? Was this a realistic kind of painting common in Colombia around 1913?
Thank you for your question. So Kano did study in France for 2 or 3 years in the early 20th century, and studied with Monet, but also traveled all over Europe, I think, just learning about classical European art as a practice. And so he definitely brought that back into his art practice in Colombia and had a major influence on those that then studied under him. My understanding is that art scholars tend to think of this painting as really like the birth of modern art in Colombia. And I haven't looked a lot at what other kinds of art were happening around this time and what differences there were. But I think a lot of 19th century art tended to be either often more religious, or also these sort of larger scenes of battles, or sort of a different kind of historical focus, where I think this particular painting and the centrality of the human subject, particularly in a time when national identity, the becoming of national identity, was just really getting rolling in a different way. That just feels really significant. Yeah. Can I ask a question to Senayon? I'm really curious.
Okay.
I'm curious about this moment in the 1990s, and you mentioned this shift from like the peak of dictatorships across Africa into transitions toward democracy. I'm curious if you've thought much about the role of neoliberalism in this kind of expansion of the African novel in relation to a different kind of self that I think started to be impressed upon and globalized through neoliberal globalization. Or just, I'm just curious, like what role you think neoliberalism has had in those shifts?
Very well, absolutely. The apparent atmosphere of relaxation certainly also had something to do with the purchase of neoliberalism around this period, because in any case, what is democracy, especially in the last 100 years or so, without neoliberalism? And so that also contributed, to the new forms of writing, to the new ways of writing, to the new ways of imagining, things, and possibly, of course, to how somebody like Ngugi, for instance, will take his time, spend over 10 years in writing one novel, what he wouldn't do in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So certainly, I agree with you. Neoliberalism too has got something to do with it. And as I revise the paper, thanks to you, I'm also going to, take that into consideration.
Great, yeah, kind of paradoxical consequence of neoliberalism, slowing down rather than speeding up. I wonder if I saw Olga's hand there. Did you have a question, Olga?
Yes, I had a question to Heidi. I was wondering about the contemporary uses of this painting, because you said that it's very much present also in a public space. I was wondering whether you know a little bit more about the context of the appearance of this very image in the public space, and why now? What's your opinion on that?
That's an interesting question. I mean, most of my knowledge about its appearance in public space is in Medellin. That's where my family is from. But I think it just has this enormous cultural role in regional identity that then expanded into national identity. So there's this a very strange attachment to this image, I think, that circulates consciously and unconsciously. In my larger paper, I talk about how even recently one of my aunts gifted the image to my mom, who lives in the US, and it felt like this gesture of, you need a piece of Colombia in your home, and this is the quintessential image that will give you that, even at some kind of unconscious level. But I am interested in how the romanticism attached to this image at an unconscious level also continues to then circulate this subtler colonial values and sense of self that continue to just perpetuate the image of the ideal national subject as this whitened mestizo colonial subject that does completely erase Black and brown life. Because even as the peace process has been ongoing, Black and Indigenous communities continue to emphasize we're not actually post-conflict, we're post-peace accords, and that means something different. But those groups continue to be targeted for all forms of violence and displaced from their lands. So I do think this image, in how much it circulates, plays some role in that perpetuation.
Great. I'll insert myself on the queue after Shivatri, but I'll turn it over to Shivatri for question now.
Yeah, so these were very thought-provoking presentations. So I have a couple of comments / questions for everyone, and just feel free to come in. So one of the first things that I was thinking about is that in these three very innovative understanding of archives that you present in your work, the logic of commodification seems very obvious in them. And so I guess, so to sort of push you on that, how would you say that under, and then this came up in Senayon's presentation and his comment right now as well, that neoliberalism has sort of, exaggerated the processes of commodification. And I'm wondering in what ways has that changed these very innovative archives that the three of you sort of engage with. To tie up with that, the other question I would like to pose, and this is of course, there has been a long-standing debate and it's up for discussion as well, that would you say that it is the ideas producing these alternative archives, or are these alternative archives producing the ideas that you're looking at as historians? Can we at all establish a teleology, or are these, much more nuanced, parallel, complex processes in intersection and in interaction with one another? That would sort of be my intervention. And yeah, thanks, Vincent, for letting me come in.
Okay, if I can begin again. Yes, yeah, sometimes we tend to maybe overrate the place of neoliberalism in some of in the rendition of these evolutions. But the fact also remains that contemporary Africa is a product of neoliberalism to a certain extent, especially when we begin to consider the recent history from the 1990s, where it is often argued that the turn of the 21st century was also coincided with the turn of neoliberalism. And like the question raised by Heidi the other time, yes, I can then say that there is certainly a sense in which an engagement with that history of the evolution and the production of the longer African novel tradition has got something to do, with neoliberalism, even when we need to begin to address other issues, including what I call the landscape of power at the time. Thank you.
To answer the first part of your question, part of my paper is also thinking about 1913 and this era around it really is when industrial culture is emerging in a different way in Colombia. Like what we see in Europe in the 19th century is really starting to happen in a new way in the early 20th century in Colombia. So thinking about the milieu of capitalism and the interlinking process of territorialization within the country with industrialization. But then this image also is arriving at a time when the technological capacity for reproduction of prints and of different versions, smaller versions of this painting to then be disseminated, I think is its own process of commodification. that in my paper, I talk a little bit about Walter Benjamin and just that process of reproduction that, you know, detaches an image from its moment of birth and gives it new meaning as it's reproduced and disseminated.
Yes, that is this commodification question is actually very interesting, especially now these days in the times of the pandemic, because especially for theater and performance art, the question is whether recorded performance is still the same performance as the one that we would have watched live, right? So this is actually an ongoing discussion, and there are some pros and cons for each of these answers. Yes, this is it. No, it isn't. I would probably say that it is a rare case of the moment when this is strangely stabilized situation as unstable performance art goes. But then of course there's I would also say that this is what remains of performance rather than performance itself, because this is all about this feedback loop. There's this German theoretician called Erika Fischer-Lichte that wrote about autopoietic feedback loop, that basically it's like the performance makes kind of impression on the audience, and the audience interacts with the performance as well, and one doesn't go without the other. So even if there's an actor that performs by themselves, this is not a performance by itself, because performance to become one needs an audience. And when it comes to whether ideas produce these archives or archives are being produced by these ideas, I would say, I'm not sure if this is a controversial opinion, I wouldn't say so, but I think that archive is always being produced by some idea, whether consciously or not. There's always an idea standing behind it. So that then I think the sooner we will know about that, the better, because then it means that we have much more agenda in creating next type of archives. Because I think that ultimately the question, and also the question of this conference, is it about a counter archive? Do we need counter archives, or like do we need archives at all? Or can we somehow disrupt this notion of archives so it wouldn't be so overpowering, right? Or we will just kind of create a set of parallel archives and archival clusters and groups of archives that will just kind of will be in the competition. But then, like both these prerogatives have some consequences, right? Because if there's no archive, then how do we proceed? And if there's just a set of cluster of archives, then it's how do we function in this world of competition of the archives? So that's interesting. Thank you.
If I may take the liberty of inserting myself into the queue here, I have a question for each of the panelists, and thank you again for your wonderful presentations. Senayon, I really appreciated the question that you posed to us so compellingly and empirically, refreshingly empirically, with sort of a length of novelistic texts. The explanation you gave, which also felt very compelling, was about authors' cultural context and the historical moments in which they're writing. I wonder if you have any reflections on the publisher side of the process. if the publishers involved here are international publishers or whether they're nationally based, whether the publisher is mitigating risk in some way or perceived risk in terms of limiting the page count or word count in novels, and whether there's market forces there that are having an effect, and market forces that change as time changes. For Heidi, again, I appreciated the sense of sort of all-encompassing force of settler ideology that you gave us by focusing particularly on this painting. I wonder if you found reflections on sort of points of contention or complexity or resistance to that all-encompassing force of ideology, a force that's not only about practices and reasons, but also about affect, as you so nicely pointed out. Are there places where there are sort of indigenous imitations or mimicry of this image, or other ways in which the image is subverted in a way that complicates the settler logic? You gave us some more recent sort of imitations that are sort of furthering the settler logic, but are there sort of points where we can think about contest in that image? And then finally for Olga, thank you again for the presentation. One work that comes to mind, just because I was teaching it, that might be of interest. Yuri McMillan has this wonderful book, Embodied Avatars, thinking about performance studies and the way that Black feminist performance complicates the seemingly good politics of performance studies in the 60s and 70s and the sort of exclusion of Black women from that discourse. And then McMillan tries to track a sort of counter archive of Black feminist performance, looking at historical material that's not usually read as performance, but reading that as performance. So that strikes me as an interesting approach, and one that puts the emphasis on power differentials and questions of domination as we're reading theatricality in archives. And in your paper, it felt like that was coming up much more, the sort of questions of power and domination that questions of theatricality get at. But so I'm curious if you can say a bit more about that now. Does theatricality just draw our attention to crossing boundaries or crossing spaces, or can it also help us attend to these questions of power and domination in interesting ways?
All right, thank you very much. Absolutely, the publishers also have a space. Let me put it that way. In my consideration of that paper, because there was a sense in which at the initial stage, publishers contributed to what was eventually considered the paradigmatic African novel, especially the African Writers series, where it was generally like an undeclared agreement that the African novel maybe shouldn't exceed 200 pages, should be a little over 100 pages and stuff like that. And that went on for so long, for about 2-3 decades, to the extent that when Ben Okri, for instance, first presented the manuscript of The Famished Road in Nigeria for publication, it was simply rejected. What the hell is wrong with you? I mean, it's like this is not a typical African novel. It does not in any way conform to the slimness we have always known of the African novel. And so the African Writers series couldn't even accept it. So to that extent, I am also considering how publishers mediated that slimness for long until the 1990s. Thank you very much.
As far as sort of contestations of the image, I haven't found sort of indigenous reworkings of the image. Doesn't mean they don't exist. I guess the one thing that comes up is that the family in the image are often thought of as displaced, more poor working people that are working the land. There's a complex system of land, I'm blanking on the word right now, where the poor are basically working to rent the land. I'm blanking on the word, but so I think that's one reading of the image that maybe could be used in solidarity with other groups that have been displaced. And that's maybe part of what happens with it, but I also think that what happens more often is that the figure of the displaced person gets reduced to this more white mestizo figure. So yeah, but I'm curious to keep an eye out for other versions.
Thank you for this question, and I don't know that book embodied avatars, so I'm really curious and excited to add it to my list. When it comes to the power in performance, of course, this is a huge issue on many layers, because we can talk about the power structure of theater itself, that is being dominated for the most part of the 20th century by this David Gordon Craig's idea that it is the director who kind of rules the stage, and he's this kind of spiritus movens of what's been happening there. So now actually there's been a lot of discussion about that for the past 20 to 30 years. But power, it depends also on our definition of performance. There's this book by John Mackenzie, Perform Or, where he describes how performance kind of drips into absolutely every area of our life, work performance, social performance. I mean, we're performing here. What are we doing here if not performing, right? Especially on this online conference, without coffee breaks, without silly conversations and jokes. And if I joke now, and I don't know where it lands, if anywhere, I just don't know. So this is a very, very particular performative situation. But performance, for instance, when it comes to yet another intersection of history and performance art, is of course the Nazi Germany and the impact of Hitler's performances on the stadiums, or the Olympics in Berlin in '34, as a way to create some kind of common social imagery of a nation in that case, or to just bring some not so fond memories from the last 5 years, just before the end of the presidential campaign in the US, when Donald Trump was opposing Hillary Clinton. He had performed a monologue on Saturday Night Live, while Hillary Clinton was only present in the jokes with the team. And also, I mean, this is the kind of social performance that has tremendous consequences, because this is an 8-minute monologue being crafted by the entire team of the best stand-uppers in the US at the peak of the presidential campaign. So actually, power and performance, this is a very very good story in itself. And of course there are good performances, and I mean, performance is just a useful tool. And I think that it very much depends on our understanding of what performance is and how it can be used. And this is why we as intellectual historians need that, because only through deeper and better understanding of this, we can actually see something new.
Wonderful. I'm afraid our time has come to an end here, but thanks especially to Philip, Swati, Maggie, Luke, Emma, and Rupsa, our audience members who stayed through all 90 minutes. of the presentation. Thanks also to our organizers, to Hussein for the wonderful response, and of course, to our three panelists for sharing their wonderful papers, which I know I'll keep thinking about for much time to come. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.